We are now live.
Dumelang Sanbonani, good afternoon everyone and welcome. My name is Kamokhelo Denyukoteledi and I'll be your moderator for this conversation today. Thanks for joining us, whether you're watching from your office, your home, or somewhere in between. We're glad that you have joined us. Today's conversation is brought to you by Futurelect, an organization dedicated to developing the next generation of public leaders across Africa. Now, this event, or rather our session, is part of Futurelect's partnership with Citizen Code ahead of the 2026 State of the Youth Address. Now, the question we are gathering around is one that feels urgent, necessary, deeply personal for many of us, which is what kind of leadership do African youth need now? Not in theory, not in textbook, but right now in our communities, our institutions, and our governments. We have two extraordinary guests with us who will help us unpack this question. And I'll introduce them in a bit, but a few housekeeping notes before we get started with our conversation today. This session will run for 60 minutes. So if you do have any questions as the engagement happens, please put your notes or your comments in the text below and we'll incorporate them as the conversation unfolds. But first, let me also now introduce the two voices who will be leading our conversation today. We have one phenomenal woman, in my view, who brings a powerful combination of legal expertise, systems thinking to the work of building better public institutions. Pamela Cunningham. She's a legal and a business management professional working at the intersection of public leadership, stakeholder management, and systems change. She serves as a stakeholder engagement officer for Build One South Africa Young Builders Movement, where she leads partnership and engagement strategies with government and civil society. Pamela is also a Futurelect alumni of the Southern Africa Public Leadership Program, and her work is driven by a deep commitment of ethical leadership, youth participation, and building a more inclusive public system. Welcome, Pamela, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Gamo. Super humbled to be here today. I think for me, this is a great opportunity just to further continue the conversation that we had started last year at the State of the Youth Address around the integration of young people into having voices beyond just being there for PR stunts.
Correct. And someone who will join us later in our conversation, but is one of our speakers, that is Advice Chuma. He's a public leader, youth advocate, and civil organizer. He works at the intersection of politics, governance, and democratic participation. He currently serves as the PR counselor in the city of Johannesburg and holds the youth leadership role within Action SA in Gauteng. Advice is also, like Pamela, a Futurelect alumni of the Southern Africa Public Leadership Program, and he also serves as the deputy chairperson of our Alumni Advisory Council. So we'll rope in Advice once he joins us a bit later on. Now, Pamela, one thing I want to start with is when we think of leadership in Africa today, right? The kind of leadership that young people are experiencing, witnessing, what gives you hope? But also on the other side of that, what concerns are there? Thank you for joining us, Advice, for today's conversation. I will both pose this question to both of you guys, but I'd like Pamela to start with that because I believe what we're seeing in Africa is a blend of different types of leadership. We have young democracies, we have in other countries where democracy is dwindling. So we're facing a yin and yang where we are seeing such great forms of leadership rise up on our continent, but others that aren't, you know. What gives you hope in this? And also what also concerns you, Pamela?
So what I would say gives me hope in this regard is, like you've already mentioned, I was part of Futurelect, and I actually was got the pleasure to meet some young leaders from across Africa, and just realizing how in our different strides, not necessarily all being part of government or in a political party per se, but how young people are actively transforming their communities in different ways and shapes and forms. So for me, that is very motivating because in as much as yes, we can bring about change through other forms of
What
vehicles,
and I
but
like.
young people realize that the Sorry. So I think what young people are realizing is they don't only need a political party as the vehicle for them to bring about transformation or change in their communities and in their countries. So across Africa, what I'm seeing when I'm keeping up with some of my other fellow cohort members is that they are doing small changes, some bigger than others, but nonetheless impactful change in their different communities. That's what gives me hope. It gives me great hope to see that young people are standing up and not just sitting and complaining on their couches to say, oh, government isn't doing anything, but they're actually standing up and taking up those opportunities to change their different communities and environments. What worries me though is we still have a large number of young people, particularly in my country, in South Africa, that are so disappointed in the system that they choose to just not be a part of it, in a sense of not going out to vote. Voter turnout has decreased over the years. And so that for me is a bit worrisome because, in as much as yes, we can bring about change through other forms of vehicles, but we also need to actively participate in our government system, such as voting, because that does have an impact on our daily lives, whether it be the supply of water, supply of electricity, consistency in these service delivery issues. It is because we go out and we vote and we decide who we want to be the ones that will be leading us towards that change and transformation.
I love your comment because it happens as we're heading to those local government elections, right? Where we saw a low turnout, like you mentioned, in the previous election. And that speaks to what people are responding to. Bringing you advice because you are a PR council in the city of Johannesburg, but integrating that with the leadership that you're also experiencing as a young person, right? What gives you hope, and what other concerns do you have regarding what you're witnessing?
All right. No, thank you so much. And I really want to take this opportunity to appreciate this platform to communicate with the broader young people, across the continent of Africa. So I think what gives me hope, it's the courage that young people start to embrace, and the emergence, of activism amongst young people across the African continent. I think there is a huge realization that, as young people across Africa, we have the potential. And in order for us to unleash that potential, is to make sure that, we participate in various forms that seeks to bring change in our communities. This is seen by the huge either it be participation by young people, political space, like myself, in terms of where I find myself, in the grassroots, where you see that, slowly but surely there is some various NGOs, that young people are led by young people, with the hope that seeks to bring change in their communities. So that tells us that, now politics are not only seen, as the change that young people can bring, but young people within their own spaces, they are trying to come with initiatives that can bring change in their communities. But when it comes to concern, like my colleague have already mentioned, that, I think we are not moving in the right pace, particularly here in South Africa, but I think in other African countries, though sometimes it turns violent, we have seen that young people self-organize themselves, to demand the change, so, but that's still a little bit of challenge, where we are seeing the participation, the electoral participation, which to some extent, when you look in terms of the local government election, maybe we can say that some of these lack of interest from young people, it is a result of the issues in terms of how the local government is structured, because the only thing when you check in terms of South African context, youth unemployment, that seeks to have lots of interest. But when you check with regard to other issues like your rates and taxes, you find that due to lack of employment, it means that majority of young people are not in a space where they say they can pay rates and taxes. So you find that the messaging from many political parties don't directly concern them, because if you speak of rates and taxes, I'm not owning a property, so you are speaking a foreign language to me, so, but when it comes to issues of unemployment, that's where we seek to engage, and then the understanding in terms of the effect. And you find that across political parties, there's no emphasis from the local government point of view in terms of how are they going to create maybe a conducive environment that will seek to create employment. So as such, we find these dynamics where young people are necessarily not going out to vote.
Yeah, I think it's what you touched on is the core of what concerns young people is not being addressed, right? The day-to-day lived experiences where you have to wake up and eat, or have to use certain basic services that may not be there, right? It feels like those are forgotten, especially when we have to speak about young people's life. But what I want to find out from you, Pamela, is when we talk about leadership, especially in Africa, what specific qualities are we talking about in terms of that leadership? Not generic ones, obviously, that one would put on a CV or a program brochure, but the real ones, the ones that we feel are missing. What does that look like to you?
So for me, although this is sometimes in textbooks, it's called servant leadership, but just to expand on it, is that not just to say, oh, I'm a servant leader because I am with the people on the ground, but it's to say, and it's not something new because it's something that existed even with our previous leaders, like our struggle heroes, because you look at the form of leadership they portrayed and it shows how they were serving the people more than themselves, because they laid their lives literally for us to be able to get the freedom we have today. So I believe that is the kind of leadership we need to bring back, particularly when it comes to the kind of leadership that young people need, is that we need leaders that aren't afraid to lose elections at the expense of delivering. We need leaders that are more afraid of disappointing their constituents than electioneering and campaigning, because we have a lot of leaders coming up to young people, for the purposes of representation, to show that we have young people in our political parties in the forefront as our speakers, or as people that are in the forefront for whatever the movement stands for, but don't give them real power to actually do anything in those political parties. We are there, but we don't have a voice in some parties. And even in some instances of government, you see it as well, that we have young people represented, whether it's in parliament, in municipality, but we only see them when it's almost time for campaigning. So I definitely believe that we need to have servant leaders, leaders that want to repair our country, leaders that understand that being a leader of our country means understanding how to fix a municipal pipe so that the water is running efficiently, understanding that as a young person stepping out of university, I need a job. And so coming up with ways to ensure that those issues that affect young people, such as unemployment, is not something that is just used as a stat in speeches, but like something that we actually look into solutions. So also having leaders that are more solution driven than leaders that want to think of us as leaders of the future, because it's all good and well when we're put up in posters and in the front line, but why are we then not fit to serve alongside our leaders right now? So we need leaders that want to partner with young people and actually listen to us when we speak in terms of what it is and how we want to come about with our solutions, because times are evolving, times have changed. So what may have worked a couple of years ago may not necessarily be applicable now, and it may not be effective. So for instance, protest politics, it worked in the last couple of years, but we see it now in institutions where learners will protest, but they're not being heard. So we need to come up with different solutions, be flexible and adaptable to the times and the evolution of everything that is going on and affecting young people in the now. So we definitely need leaders that are flexible, adaptable, and put us in the forefront before wanting to have big cars and big houses, but actually wanting to deliver and listen to its people.
Yeah, I think you touched on this idea of performative leadership, right? Where you are placed in somewhere, but you actually don't have any influence or any power in that. But when we talk about young people having to take to the streets, one thing, especially now because we're in Youth Month, one thing we can always remember is 2026, where we had Fees Must Fall, right?
Yeah.
And we saw this entire majority of our public institutions stand up. And it took a while for leaders to actually listen to the plight of how inaccessible higher education is, or how students are struggling in these institutions. And till
Yeah.
this day, we still have an issue of those who want to access, higher education. So thank you for that addition, Pamela. For you, advice. What are those qualities in the type of leadership we need in Africa today? What do you think is actually missing, and what does it look like for you?
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I think for me, in a context of Africa, particularly for ourselves as young people, we need leadership that turns vision into action, leadership that turns power into service and challenges into opportunities, because in so many instances, we have different visions, the ideas that we think can transform our communities, but you find that if uh, those visions are not turned into actions, in terms of what needs to be done, the power that we have within our communities, if we don't channel that to serve our communities, and, despite all the challenges again that we face, if we are not solution orientated to turn those challenges into opportunities, that's where I see it. It is the leadership that is courageous enough, to challenge injustices, wise enough to make sure that we unite our diverse communities. I'm saying this because in some instances, if you check currently in terms of the Africa on its own and within their communities in terms of how diverse we are, if we are unable to turn diversity into our community to ensure that we unite one another, it means that we'll have a long way to go, and we must be committed enough to leave the future generation to the better than we find it now. So it's one of those things, the combination of these many factors, that I think, it's the kind of leadership that currently we need, as Africans, in particular as the young people, because it's well and said sometimes, to think and have these ideas, but we don't action. It's like now we are going into local government elections. We
Yeah.
must think that, uh, how can local government create opportunities for young people, so that young people can be employed, and make sure that those ideas that we find out of this engagement, we turn into action. And then once we can be able to find that and then say, we think that this particular party, it's the one that thinking in terms of the solution that can create employment for young people, or if it's issues of education, how can we make sure that our universities across the cities, where in our municipalities, young people are absorbed in this kind of, can there be a partnership in terms of internship? Because the understanding, sometimes you find that young people go to university immediately they go to university, they're still in service hours that they need to perform in order for them to receive their qualification. You find that municipalities are failing in terms of providing certain service deliveries, in terms of the capacity. They are unable to hire people, maybe due to issues of budget. I'm just giving an example. But you find that we have university graduates who seeks those hours where they could be able to go and perform some of these duties. And then in meantime, they get the necessary hours to have their qualifications, while in the other way, they are contributing in terms of bettering our municipalities. So it's some of these kind of ideas that can assist us and move forward as the young people or in the African continent, and particular maybe here in South Africa.
And advice, I want to pick your brain there, because you're a PR counselor, right? So you get to see how decisions get made behind closed doors, in communities, in moments that don't necessarily make it to social media. What is the one thing you feel like young people are watching today that they don't understand how political system actually works? Because a lot of them can say, I'm using my power to vote, or rather my right to vote. This is who I decide, right? But it still seems like we're lagging behind. So what's happening, according to, or in your experience, is happening in the decision making, where perhaps there might be this disconnect as to what people think they're voting for and actually what gets implemented?
Yeah, no, I think I have so far, I have a very disappointing and disheartening experience, because in a council space, it's no longer about in terms of this is what is going to bring solution, either to the community or maybe to young people. It's about, who has more numbers, and where is this idea coming from? To the extent that if you find that maybe a political party that advice represent, or any other member, or in this case Pamela represent, if she comes up with an idea that it's so good enough that can transform the community, because it's coming from Pamela and from this particular party, which is not having majority, you find that it's very difficult for it to be implemented. Even if you can propose a motion, the chances of that particular motion to succeed, are very low. If in any case, and then that particular motion and the idea succeed, and in terms of its implementation, there's no follow-up. There's so many good motions and resolutions that the council are taking, in various council sitting, but there is no way where after these decisions are taken, and then we revisit them to say, where are we on this one? You find that they say, no, they want to establish, for instance, in this case of City of Johannesburg, they say, all right, there is a need to establish a youth directorate. This youth directorate will look after the interest of young people, ensuring that we have opportunities, bursaries, and employment for young people, and to engage young people on the ground. But sadly, every time that particular structure, and then it's being invited to account, you see young people who come to committees unprepared, committees without understanding their KPI, or even bringing material evidence to say, as youth directorate, this is what we are doing. And in terms of the council, there's no accountability from the council as it's in its entirety, or even Section 79 committee to review these decisions, to say, but this was your mandate when you were established. How far in terms of how many engagement have you had with young people? How many maybe even to engage with private sectors to ensure that we advance young people issues, and maybe also curtail some of these unemployment. So that's where I'm saying that there's no decision are being taken, and there's no follow-up. It's like they can even say that on this particular council, we have resolved to allocate such amount to ensure that we give bursaries to young people. But you find that there's no mechanism where they come back and report to say, out of this allocated amount, this is how many bursaries we have given, or out of this number, this is how many opportunities have been created. So those mechanisms, it's very disappointing. But with the hope that as many of ourselves as young people when we participate in a political space and see some of these challenges, it is our responsibility to raise it, because maybe from the years back before young people started to emerge in political space, it was a norm that this is how it's done and it will continue to be done in this way. But some of us in these spaces, we start to challenge this because at an extreme, it looks like maybe some opportunities are created for the selected few, and with no mechanism to hold those selected few, because in its entirety, they must serve all young people across the city and the spaces where they find themselves. So yeah, that's what I can say for now.
I think just to echo what you're saying, look, we have an accountability problem, but the best way to tackle it, because it's unfortunately a system, is also to have young people enter the space or the political space who are equipped, who are ethical, who are able to call for accountability, who are able to remember the reason why they got voted into the first place, right? The mandate that they were given by those who entrusted them with their vote. Pamela, you work specifically on bridging this relationship between young people, government, and civil society. So it's this triangle of these three different stakeholders. Where do you think this relationship sometimes breaks? And then when it does happen, who is at the responsibility of fixing it? Because you have your young people who are on the ground, who know what they deserve, who have the right to basic services, to inclusion. You have government on the side of what advice has just said, with sometimes the systems do break down and sometimes there's no accountability, and then you also have civil society on the other side.
So in my view, civil societies play a really huge role when it comes to educating young people about how the systems work, because what I have found, even with my own friend group sometimes, is that we understand the basics of how the system works and what it means in terms of public participation. Most of us think that just means waking up on the day of voting day to go and cast our votes, and that's it. But we have various bills, we have various policies that are gazetted and that are sent out for public participation that requires us as young people to get involved in. But you'll find most of the time we aren't even aware of those. So, to no fault of our own, because sometimes I do feel like the government itself doesn't do such a good job in making us aware of those publications. So for someone who's not necessarily interested in politics and isn't following the political changes and like the updates on different policies that are happening in our country, they may not necessarily just go on a random day to read up what has now been put out for public participation. So what I think civil societies have really been trying to do is bridge that understanding between what is readily available to us as citizens for us to actually be able to contribute towards what systems are put in place, what policies are put out there for not just young people, but just for our country holistically. Because yes, we have our own challenges as young people, but also the problems that the the generation before us will leave there will have an impact on us, even if it doesn't directly impact us today and right now. So I do believe that definitely civil societies that such as, well, I won't mention names, but a couple of the ones that we've worked with, they really do try to go out in various communities that are neglected or aren't, people don't go into those communities to make sure that people actually know what it means to actively participate beyond just casting your vote. So I do think where the gap does come in is in government then supporting the civil societies to ensure that they also play their part. And then with regards to political parties, I can't speak to all political parties because I'm not involved in all political parties. But one of the things that I do know a couple of political parties, is particularly some that are like newer than others, have tried to do is to make sure that young people actively actually participate in the civic education that is done in different platforms, so that we can then take back that information to our communities and go out and educate our communities. So even in a simple conversation with your friends, your colleagues, you can just inform people about what it means to be an active citizen beyond just casting your vote. Because definitely, I feel it's a big deficit in our country, because everyone thinks the only time you can participate actively is by going to cast your vote. Well, not everyone, but most people, especially young people, most of them are of the notion that that's the only sort of impact you can go about to be actively participating in our system, is to go and campaign or to be part of the electioneering that happens. But there's also work that happens beyond that or before that, and ongoing work that goes on in between that as well. And civic education does try to bridge that gap. So Futurelect as well, in its own programs, does also teach us in various ways to go beyond just the campaign season, because I think that is what a lot of us are aware of, and not everything else that goes on before that or after that. Because we need to, I think, like Advice mentioned, hold our leaders accountable, because simply casting our vote does not hold them accountable. But then we need to go back to them and say, you came to me in my community and said you would make sure we have access to electricity, water, access to higher learning. So we need to be able to stand up, and the same way we were out there campaigning and electioneering, go back and also hold them accountable according to the different measures that are in place, because there are a lot of different policies and different regulations that allow for us to be able to hold our leaders accountable, but we need to be educated on how we go about doing that as well.
On here regarding um, civic education, right? And the work also being done by Futurelect. We have the app, the civic education app, because as a young person, you can only have so much impact or be knowledgeable about what's happening when you actually have the content, when you actually know what is happening, why are certain things happening, why do we have certain systems, how do these systems operate. And I like what you said, Pamela, regarding that we don't need to just be within the political space to be active, right? There's certain ways of being a young person and still be active in your country and showing leadership, right? Away from the party lines. Advice, speaking on this point of inclusion and getting more young people into this leadership spaces, eh, how do we actually start doing that? If I'm a young person and I'm watching this, I'm from Soweto, I'm from Katlehong, I'm sitting in Sandton or Pretoria, and I'm saying, I want to be more involved and become a leader. I want to use the youth month to actually have some impact, but I'm not looking into politics. What would you say to someone like that?
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I think there's many ways for ourselves, and other fellow young people, who seeks to make difference in their communities, either it be Soweto, like you mentioned, Deep Sloot, so we have various NGOs, which in this case, like I've said in the beginning, that many of these NGOs nowadays, young people are occupying that particular spaces, but we also have some old existing NGOs, which we all know in their communities, they are doing various programs. So as young people, it's very important for ourselves, to find ourselves in those NGOs, and other civic organization, offering our skills. You might see it as a small thing, like for instance, if you find an NGO in your in your community, you find that maybe they might be struggling with admin, so in order for you to assist them, you can volunteer, 7 hours of your 7 hours of your week, or if, let's take for instance, with the high unemployment, that we are facing in the country, where majority of ourselves as young people are seated at home, it's very important, to find yourself in those spaces, making difference, doing what that particular NGO do in a voluntary manner. You'll never know in terms of where it will take us, but out of it, you learn something. You'll start to appreciate yourself and the contribution that you are making. I always say that sometimes to make change, it's not by giving people money or maybe providing food parcel, but for yourself to find you in that particular organization that are trying to address some of the issues, either it be GBV in your community, either it be poverty alleviation, either it be soup kitchen, you contribute within that process, you learn a lot and you'll develop people skills, at your earliest as young people, and then you'll start to understand that, these are some of the change that we need, and in doing so, it will open so many opportunities for you to meet with other fellow young people, and also, the sponsors, when they came, they find you there, they understand what are you doing. It might be your breakaway, but when you are seated at home without participating, it becomes a problem. And sometimes, in other communities, they have the cleanup campaigns, as a community. If you participate and after cleaning up, you look back, you'll understand that you have made the difference. So there's so many ways to make difference. And when we find ourselves in these spaces, that's how we grow. That's how we develop our skills. That's how we in some instances, that's how we build our profile, so that even when we are at the highest of our leadership, when we grow and then we grow from the roots, we'll have so much appreciation, and we'll lead with empathy, and we'll lead with understanding, because sometimes in terms of what we see in the leadership role, you find that advice is very smart. I'm just giving an example, or maybe I'll use my colleague Pamela.
It's
Yeah,
okay.
so Pamela, she's very smart, she's educated, but you find that she was so blessed, to the extent that she didn't give much back in terms of working with the communities in the ground. So as she grow in her leadership, that gap starts to show up through her empathy and the thinking, because from someone who is well off and have been well off and then find themselves at the highest position, and someone who have started at the poverty level, if that particular person is conscious enough, how they address matters, there's huge difference in terms of the thinking. I can give maybe a practical example. You find that someone who's coming from an affluent areas, who they've done very well, when they come and organize maybe event at the community level, they might think that a fruit, it's a very kind of good thing to give to the community, because they are thinking from a healthy point of view. So they won't bring much after the program. They can just provide people with fruits. It's healthy. But you find that from the community point of view, they see it as a disrespect. How can you give us fruit? I woke up early in the morning, to participate in this program, so a fruit is the least thing that you could have given me. My child, I left my children without anything to eat. Myself as an adult, I didn't eat. Then now you are giving me a fruit. So that's how this smallest thin line it shows to say, in those communities there's hunger. So the anything that you can do is to provide them with, if you have. If you don't have, they will appreciate and understand. But to come and give something that won't address their issues currently, either it be at home, because others, when you give them, they might not even eat it. They will say, what, I'll go and share this meal with my family. So those are kind of small things, and if young people participate at the earliest, even if you are in high school, start participating in your community. It grows you are thinking, it broadens your you are yes, you are how you see life in general, and the level of empathy that it requires when you are working with people. In some instances, you're working with people who can be older than to be your parents, so you need to ground yourself with respect. And so there's so many dynamics that young people can learn, and it's very important for them to be in their communities.
I like what you're saying, advice, and it reminds me of this Latin saying, "Quid timba," right? Meaning what saying it right, but that's how we used to say it in our high school, right? What can I give? Um, and oftentimes is as young people we wait for moments, right? You wait, let me finish high school, let me finish varsity, let me to stand up. And at times you have the power already. You have the power to say, can we gather my fellow community? Let's patrol, or let's involve the police. Let's have these meetings and engagements, right? It doesn't take a moment. I guess it takes courage, right? It takes support. And to you, Pamela, what kind of support do you think young leaders will need in order to then have that courage to stand up and say, this is what I feel like my contribution will be, or this is what I feel like is missing?
So I think I touched on civic education in my previous comment. I do believe a lot of us learn about it quite late in our lives, and I think if it could be incorporated somehow in earlier stages, whether it's like high school or university level, that could definitely help to give others courage. Because I myself, when I started off with Futurelect, yes, I was an active participant in political affairs. However, very, very afraid because politics to me had been portrayed a particular way in our country, in that you needed to be radical, you needed to be this, you needed to be that. And for the most part, I didn't identify with a lot of what politics looked like in those spaces. And so I always just felt like, okay, maybe I should just do it in the background and not be out there about my political affiliations, or what it is that, or how it is that I want to practice helping out my community, and how it is that I want to be involved and participate. So definitely, I do think programs such as Futurelect, or even just civic education at a much earlier age, could help, especially because we are people obviously of different personalities, and we are built differently. So for others, it may come naturally and it may be easier, but for others, it may not be as easy, because you'll find someone with a very great idea, but because someone is louder than they are, so they feel inferior to those people. So I do think that, and also just um, making it okay for young people to know that you don't have to be this way to participate in politics, but your voice in its own form and in the way that you present yourself in the space is valuable. And definitely, I think as young people, the biggest thing is our leaders, whether it's in politics or just across the board, need to invest in young people. Because if you believe that something is really an asset, you invest in it. And so I don't believe that there's much investment that is done in young people generally. I feel like a lot of the times we're called in when it's time to show face. But in terms of equipping and upskilling and making sure that, okay, you're able to sit down in a crowd and not be afraid to speak, to be able to engage in communities without the fear of being judged, or feeling like maybe you're not the right fit. So I definitely feel there needs to be more investment in young people, whether it's in the form of civic education, support from our different leaders, but also just in a sense of having an environment that is enabling. And that is not just from our government, but just our communities, because in a lot of our communities, a lot of young people like we do a lot of different initiatives in our communities, whether it's like pickups like that were mentioned, or trying to go to your local hall and helping matriculants to register for university and NSFAS, exposing them to opportunities that you had maybe that they may not necessarily be exposed to. So all those different things are things that young people are already implementing, but we definitely need more support and investment from our leaders that are ahead of us and have like more of the financial capital and strength to be able to make sure that it's not just a once off, because yes, one or two people can go about with these different initiatives, but for the longevity we definitely need more investment in young people.
I like what you're saying. It goes back to the core of our discussion, right? What kind of leadership do African youth need? And I think what we're getting from our discussion thus far is we need us, right? We need young people. We need ethical leaders. We need leaders who are there to solve whatever issues they're seeing, but who are also knowledgeable of their system, the systems that are in place, who are empathetic, like Advice had said. Before I come back to you guys, I just want to read a few comments which we've seen pop up on the screen from Shannon Isau. I hope I'm saying your surname right. Saying exactly, you need to know the needs of the community you are serving and not just give for the sake of giving and looking good, right? It's that idea of not being like a participation show off or whatever you may call it, that your leadership actually touches the people who matter the most. It touches the people on the ground. When we look at Africa's Welibanzi saying, I agree. I think we also need to involve the youth themselves in decision making. It's not enough to only have young people participate without any real power to shape the decisions being made. I agree with the notion that the core of what concerns young people is not being addressed. And when we go to Morongwa Lamola, saying, I think the problem is that we have many parties and anyone can make up and have a party. So that's a party view. But one I love most, Julieta is saying more young leaders are standing up and getting involved. And that's incredibly hopeful. That we are the change that we want to see, right? Is that as much as we're going to look at existing systems that will want to invest, like you're saying, Pamela, that we need investment in young people, at the crux of it, we need us. We need that investment also in ourselves. But to grow on that point, Advice, this is when I bring you in. Who invested us? Yes, we can invest in each other, stand up and make impact in your community. But who is supposed to invest in young people and young leadership on our continent?
Yeah, no, thank you so much. A very important and complex question, because I think, things now are evolving, like you rightfully say, that who's supposed to do that investment in ourselves as young people. But when you look at, organizations like Futurelect, I think, the founder, they took it upon themselves, to say, let's create that conducive environment. Young people have potential, and I think it takes courage, to come up with this concept. Like, for instance, even this platform on its own, it means that, ourselves as young people, we are given a platform, to have a voice, So I think in this case, I will have to say that organizations like Futurelect, they are doing a great job, and other civic organization, because this responsibility does not only necessarily rest with the government. Yes, government must, ensure that they invest in the generations, of young people, to ensure that young people are equipped. But that's not only enough. It means that even the private sector have a duty to invest in young people, and they can invest in various ways, by making sure that, with organizations like Futurelect, who are already in the forefront, and many other organizations that are doing the work that seeks to equip young people, have necessary resources where they can tap in their reserve funds to say, in order to strengthen democracy and to develop, the future leaders, to develop not only future leaders, but ethical and leaders who are accountable, leaders who understand, the challenges that their communities face, leaders who will be incorruptible, because sometimes when people get into power and they are not ready, or maybe they are ready, but you find that they lack the fine skills that these organizations, civic organization, in this case, I will use Futurelect as an example. You don't have time to reflect and speak to your conscience. Someone just get excited. They are being told that, what, this is what we are going to do. This is how many millions you are going. That person is not developed to check that, is this thing ethical? Is there integrity in what I'm discussing here? Am I compromising myself? What are the values that made me to step forward and be a leader? So you see, these are the important role that, civic organizations are playing, and I'm saying that it's multifaceted, because the government need also to provide resources to these organizations. The private sector, they are already on another journey where maybe this particular company, they are making profits, they are assisting the community in their own innovation way, but they must give back, in terms of the development of the young people of this country and across Africa, to ensure that the emergence of the next generation of leaders are leaders who are ethical. Because if you check in Africa, without using any stats, maybe in this case, but if you do your own observations, you realize that there are so many questionable ethical things that are happening. Our leaders, the morality of their leadership, the leadership style, the lack of consciousness in terms of addressing the issues that affects the community. So it means that the current leaders that are leading Africa in various space, political and in some certain government institutions and some civic organizations who are so much affiliated with government, it needs change. And that change can be only brought when young people like ourselves and the rest of everyone are trained, are given necessary equipment at their earliest before they ascend to these positions, so that at least they can lead differently than what's currently happening now across Africa. So yes, organizations like Future Elects, other civic organizations, they need to make sure that there is a collaboration that seeks to galvanize resources to ensure that we don't lack resources. We don't find ourselves in a situation where these organizations, they say no, we are phasing out this particular program because we no longer having enough funding. So these are the kind of things that private sector, the government needs to take accountability and participate in the development of ourselves as young people in the continent of Africa.
I like that. Let's unite. Let's unite all structures to ensure that we have inclusive, with ethical leadership, and different spheres are coming together to ensure that constant investment is being made to ensure that we have these kinds of leaders. We are coming to the end of our time together, but to you, Pamela, I want you to have our final question that I hope will stay with everyone who's watching, but even that one person, that young person, if they will come to you right now and say, Pamela, I have a project, I have a movement, I have something I want to build, but I'm not ready. I don't feel qualified. But I feel like I have a voice. I feel like I can make a difference. What would you say to that person?
Yeah, definitely. I think I would say go for it, because sometimes it takes that leap of faith for you to actually be able to see that that great idea or innovation that came to your mind was not by chance, but it was something that was planted in you because it's something that either your community, your country, or even your continent needs. So I would definitely say go for it. Rather do it scared. Do it scared, do it feeling like, you know what, I'm not ready for this. But definitely, I would also say, in the crux of it all, is just always be prepared so that when opportunity comes along, you're ready to take that leap. Because definitely, I think a lot of us stay in our minds too much and end up not executing on a lot of things because we're so scared. So do it scared. Do it scared. That's the best thing you can ever do for yourself. And what's the worst that could happen? You'll fall amongst the stars. So
Right? Yeah, do it scared. Overall, is we need young people are the African leaders we need, right?
yeah,
So do it scared. Do it with the knowledge. So equip yourself, educate yourself, but also find a community for yourself that will help you grow as a leader. But also give back and give of what you feel like as a leader you're seeing that missing part or that missing key in your community. Thank you, Advice Chuma, Pamela Cunningham, for this conversation. It's been honest, it's been engaging. You both embody exactly the kind of leadership we've been talking about today. And Future Elect is very, very proud to call you an alumni. To everyone who's watching, thank you for being part of this. The conversation does not end here. It continues at the State of the Youth Address on the 15th of June in Cape Town. But from us
thank,
at Future Elect, keep asking the hard question, keep showing up, and keep leading. We'll see you soon.
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.